My name is Eric Schurenberg. I am the CEO of Mansueto Ventures, which is the publishing company that owns Inc. and Fast Company magazines. And it is my pleasure to introduce Ray Dalio, who is the founder, co-CEO, and co-chief investment officer of Bridgewater Associates, which is the largest hedge fund in the world with $160 billion under management. As I said, he is, throughout his 40-year career, become one of the most successful investors in history. However, Ray is not going to talk about the stock market or the economy. So if you are here for get-rich-quick tips, I suggest you go find an ICO panel and listen to that. Instead, Ray is going to talk about the leadership principles and practices that he believes were the secrets of Bridgewater's success and can be applied effectively in your own company as well. The ideas were the subject of Ray's book, Principles, Life and Work, which was Amazon's #1 recommended business book for 2017. Now, just for your information, this session will be split into 3 parts. The first 20 minutes, Ray will present his ideas alone on stage in a keynote. Then I'll come back on stage with the idea of drilling deeper into the things that you'll hear from Ray, the ideas like meritocracy, radical transparency, algorithmic decision-making. And finally, Ray will take questions from the floor. There's a mic there in the middle, so go, when you have a question, line up by the mic. Okay? But first, ladies and gentlemen, Ray Dalio.
Thank you. I want to talk about principles in general before I get into my principles, the things that help me. I had sort of accidentally gotten into the habit of writing down my principles, and it changed everything. So initially, when I started to make decisions in the markets, I would write down, why did I make that trade? And then I began to see that if I knew those criteria, I could take those criteria and test how they would have worked in other time frames and countries, and I got perspective on that, and I saw that the same things happened over and over again in different countries, and it gave me a great perspective. And then I began to realize that whenever I was making any decision, it was a good thing to write down at that time the reasons I made those decisions. And I found that it was invaluable in dealing with all the people that I was dealing with, people in my company and so on. And it enhanced my reflections on those decisions because I would then be able to create clarity. And that perspective then changed my view of the world because I began to see that the same things would happen over and over again. And I would think, okay, what type of thing is that? And what species of decision am I making? And how do I best make that decision? I would also be very much in contact with my values. What were my values that were so important for me to live out in the form of these types of principles? And then I began to find out that if I was clear enough on those principles, I can convert those principles into algorithms that would help me make decisions. Because basically algorithms are just the same rules, just expressed in a different language. And by putting that language into a computer and taking in data, then in parallel with my own decision making, I could have the computer make the decisions using those same criteria. And that was incredibly empowering. And I think that principles are extremely important in terms of relationships between people. And I think we're losing the focus on principles for various reasons through time. You know, there used to be collective principles in many ways, maybe because of religion, and religion is less the case. And even today in our society, I don't think it's necessarily clear what principles we're going after as a country or as a people. And so clarity of what are your principles that bind you together or separate you, that sort of clarity and what principles are valuable to you as an individual and how do you live those things out are so invaluable. So the things that I would like to pass along, most importantly, is that you think about your own principles and you be clear, and if you write those principles down in a crystal clear way and communicate them with others, that it's extremely, extremely powerful. So I'm going to, that's the most important message I can convey, but I'm going to then take you through my evolution and my principles that help me a lot. So the way I look at the world is we all have our encounters with whatever we're going out after. And so we all learn about how reality works. You might be an engineer, you might be an architect, you might be a parent, and so on. And in those encounters, you learn how reality works. And then we gain our principles. So I don't claim to know about a lot of things, but the areas that I was involved with is economics, investments, work, and life principles. And I chose to pass along these principles at this stage in my life, most importantly, life and work principles, and then I'll pass along economic and investment principles, because those were the things that I had experience with and it helped me. And so I'm doing that in two forms. I'm putting the life and economic principles out, which is out, and then I'll follow with the others. So I really want to, most importantly though, talk about life and work principles and what has worked. And I really do believe this is invaluable, that almost anybody can experience that. So this is what life looked like to me, and this is what it looks like. Okay, for me, I wanted to go after my audacious goals, big dreams, and along those ways, you have successes and failures. But you have those failures. And the failures are the most valuable experiences, because the failures indicate to you that you really need to reflect on those failures. Because if you don't produce them again, find ways of getting around them, you're going to be a lot more successful. But there's an aversion to failures, okay? So I came to realize that they're advantageous. Look, if you are either an investor or an entrepreneur, you have to be an independent thinker. In an investor, you have to be an independent thinker because the consensus is viewed in the price. So you have to have a different view than the consensus and be right. And you're going to be wrong a fair amount. And if you're an entrepreneur, you also have to be an independent thinker and do things that you haven't been done before. And so as a result, you're going to encounter a certain amount of failure. And when you encounter that failure, the most important thing is what you do with that failure. So recognize failure and then make the most of it. I began to change my attitude about failure in that I began to see them as puzzles that would give me gems if I handled the puzzles well, if I solved the puzzle. The puzzle was, what would I do differently in the future? And the gems were principles that I would write down that would help me do those things. So as a result, I think this is true mostly for all of us. When we go along, we're going to encounter failures. We don't go straight to successes. And then how you approach that, the learning of then principles that make you better and writing down those principles and compounding those and leading to improvements and then going after more audacious goals. And life looks basically like this cycle that happens over and over again. And so there's basically 5 steps to success. I think there's the 5 steps for success. You do these 5 things and you will be successful. First, know what your goals are. What are you going after? You have to be clear on those. Second, encounter your problems. You will encounter your problems. And counter those problems and not tolerate those problems. Diagnose those problems to the root cause. And the root cause might be things that a lot of people don't want to look at. The root cause might be your own personal weaknesses. Everybody has personal weaknesses. I guarantee you, everybody's got personal weaknesses. And if you're reluctant to look at those personal weaknesses, or whatever it is that's causing you the problems, you're not going to evolve and get around it. So you have to diagnose, step 3, you have to diagnose those problems to get at their specific root causes. And then, when you know the root cause, whatever it is, you have to design a path to get around that root cause. And if you design that path, and so you say you're going to do these things to get past it, then you have to do them. You have to push through and actually do what you set out to do. And if you do those 5 things over and over again, you will be successful. That's what it is. And in many cases, most cases, not everybody can do those well. There are some things that people could do well, some things they can't do well. But by working with others who are good at those things, you can find out how to achieve success. For example, maybe more big picture thinkers are greater at getting at the goals, but how they tolerate or diagnose, or some people are just not good at pushing through to results. They write down they're going to do these things and they don't do them. So you might need the help of other people to get through it. But if you do those 5 things, you will have a successful life. That's basically how it looks. So it's this looping process to me. That's how it looks. Okay, so I want to take you into then, one of my most meaningful mistakes. So in 1980, 1981, I had calculated that American banks had lent more money to foreign countries than those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that they would default on their loans, and that would cause a major economic crisis. And it was a very, very controversial point of view at the time. And that part of it was right. In August 1982, Mexico defaulted on its loans. We had a banking crisis, and a number of other countries failed. And I thought that there would be an economic collapse of that. Because I had anticipated this crisis that others hadn't, and people wanted to understand it, I was asked to testify to Congress, and I was asked to appear on Wall Street Week, which was the investment show at the time. So I just want to give you a glimpse into that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mitchell, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be able to appear before you in examination with what is going wrong with our economy. The economy is now flat, teetering on the brink of failure.
You were recently quoted in an article. You said, "I can say this with absolute certainty because I know how markets work."
I can say with absolute certainty that if you look at the liquidity base in the corporations and the world as a whole, that there's such a reduced level of liquidity that you can't return to an era of stagflation.
Isn't he arrogant? Incredibly arrogant, right? Wasn't I incredibly arrogant? I couldn't have been more wrong. That was the exact bottom in the stock market for a great bull move. I lost money for me, I lost money for my clients. I lost so much money that I was broke. I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help pay for my family bills. It was an extremely, extremely painful experience. But it changed how I thought completely, how I approached thinking completely. What it did is it gave me the humility that I needed to balance with my audacity, the fear of being wrong. It made me start to think, how do I know that I'm right? In other words, rather than thinking I'm right, how do I know I'm right? How do I raise the standard of being right? It made me want to find the smartest people that I could who disagreed with me. And it made me want to change how do I deal with risk and diversification and those kinds of things. So it changed my approach to decision making. And basically what I learned is, look, there's what you know and there's what you don't know, right? So many people, me included, but so many people put so much emphasis on what they know, and they have such a pride in knowing that it stands in the way of their dealing with what they don't know. And what you don't know is so much greater than what you know and so much more valuable than what any one person can know. And so humility is the open-mindedness to get you the best thinking around, to raise your probabilities of being right. So I've learned, and I've watched other people who are great people. I've had the opportunity to meet the most successful people in the world. And truly, let me say, they all fail, okay? They all learn humility. They don't talk too much about their failure. But if you ask them and you go through this, they have all had their failures, they've all had their metamorphoses, their changes, and they've all gained humility. That's why they speak with each other, largely, to pick the best brains that they can to exchange those thoughts. So the power of humility is an enormous power. So what I wanted to do when I learned this is I wanted to create an idea meritocracy. What I wanted to do was to create, bring together the best independent thinkers I could to have thoughtful disagreement and have the best ideas win out. They didn't have to be my ideas. How do I think better? So now, when you think about the greatest minds that you know, imagine a company that they can then have the best thinking. So to have thoughtful disagreement and an idea meritocracy, to systemize that, and then that brings us our successes and our failures, and we make the most out of our failures from learning, and that has led to happy employees and clients, which brings in more independent thinkers and more audacious goals, and that's what we do over and over again. So that's the formula, that's been our formula for success. Okay, to have an idea meritocracy. Okay, an idea meritocracy is the best ideas winning out. Not only does it give you better ideas, but you have a fairer system. You're going to get better people in idea meritocracy, and you're going to have a fairer system. Because if everybody believes that the system is fair and that they're going to be able to, the best ideas win out if they have enough merit, they're connected to the organization. If they're not operating that way and you just tell them to follow your instructions, not only won't they be as engaged, and they'll probably talk about their complaints at the water cooler behind everybody's, they could do it better, rather than put it out there. And they're not going to have, so they're not going to have the buy-in. And you're going to also end up with a bunch of ass kissers rather than people who are essentially good independent thinkers. And that means you're not going to have as much leverage, because if you have good independent thinkers who are connected to you, then they can think independently. If you are constantly telling them what to do, they're not going to be effective. So an idea meritocracy is great. And what do you need to do have an idea meritocracy? Okay, 3 steps. You have to put your honest thoughts on the table. And other people have to put their honest thoughts on the table. Okay? So what's the problem? Okay. People don't do that. People don't put their honest thoughts on the table for others to see. We'll get into that in a minute. But you have to put your honest thoughts on the table. If you don't know what you're thinking and other people are thinking, think about how incredibly inefficient that is. I mean, besides being dishonest, it's like, who knows what really is going on, because nobody's actually even telling their thoughts, and they all have merit, without merit. I think the greatest tragedy of most people, greatest tragedy, therefore, of our society, is that people have wrong opinions in their heads that they don't put out there in stress test. And they act on these wrong opinions. It would be so easy to take those opinions and say, maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right. And so you need to have thoughtful disagreement. Look, if you disagree with somebody, you might be right or they might be right. How do you know that you're not the wrong one? So to be attached to your own independent opinions, and when there's disagreement, thoughtful disagreement means exploring open-mindedly the various thinking so that you can get around it. To enjoy it, to have curiosity, to have fear of being wrong, being dealt with, rather than most people when they're disagreeing. It's an emotional, difficult thing to do. They treat it like a fight. They block opinions, and that's a tragedy. So you have to understand the art of thoughtful disagreement. Also, if you're working with independent thinkers, and you want to work with independent thinkers, you're going to have that disagreement and you want to get past it. So there's a tremendous power for being able to have thoughtful disagreement and get past that. And then you have to have protocols for when there's disagreement. How do you get past it in order to have the best ideas win out? The other thing about it is you have to know what you're like and what other people are like. You're all different. There's different personality profiles. There are different things. And I promise you that you don't have any clue of what is going on in the other person's mind. When you start to get transparency, you get a sense of that. But different people think differently. And so you have to know what are your strengths and weaknesses. So, okay, I'm just going to give you a quick video.
A week after the U.S. election, our research team held a meeting to discuss what a Trump presidency would mean for the U.S. economy. Naturally, people had different opinions on the matter and how we were approaching the discussion. The dot collector collects these views. It has a list of a few dozen attributes, and so whenever someone thinks something about another person's thinking, it's easy for them to convey that assessment. They simply note the attribute and provide a rating from 1 to 10. For example, as the meeting began, a researcher named Jen rated me a 3, in other words, badly, for not showing a good balance of assertiveness and open-mindedness. As the meeting transpired, Jen's assessments of people added up like this. Others in the room had very different opinions. That's normal. Different people are always going to have different opinions. And who knows who's right? Let's just look at what people thought about how I was doing. Some people thought I did well, others poorly. With each of these views, we can explore the thinking behind the numbers. Here's what Jen and Larry said. Note that everyone gets to express their thinking, including their critical thinking, regardless of their position in the company. Jen, who's 24 years old and fresh out of college, can tell me, the CEO of the company, that I'm approaching things terribly. This tool helps people both express their opinions and separate themselves from their opinions to see things from a higher level. When Jen and others shift their attentions from inputting their opinions to looking down on the whole screen, their perspective changes. They see their own opinions as just one of many, and naturally start to ask themselves, how do I know my opinion is right? That shift in perspective of going above it and seeing the full range of views shifts the conversation from arguing over individual opinions to figuring out objective criteria for determining which opinions are best. Behind the dot collector is a computer that is watching what all these people are thinking, correlates it with how they think, and communicates back to each of them based on that. Then it draws the data from the meetings to create a pointillist painting of what people are like and how they think. And it does all that guided by algorithms. Knowing what people are like helps to match them up better with their jobs. For example, a creative thinker who is unreliable might be matched up with someone who is reliable but not creative. Knowing what people are like also allows us to decide what responsibilities to give them and to weigh our decisions based on people's merits. We call it their believability. Here's an example of a vote that we took where the majority of people felt one way, but when we weighed people's views on the basis of their merits, the answer was completely different. This process allows us to make decisions not based on democracy and not based on autocracy, but based on algorithms that take people's believability into consideration.
Yeah, we really do that. Isn't that wild? So what's the biggest barrier to this? Intellectually, people want it. If you think it through, and I was to ask you, would you like to know what I really think about you? Would you like to be able to express what you really think about me or something? Would you like to know your weaknesses? Intellectually, you say yes, and emotionally, we have a barrier. And so our biggest barrier in life, I think, is are we going to let our emotions stand in the way of the things that we think we should do to be good? And so that becomes the main issue. So, and we'll talk about probably in the question and answer session, we'll show it. So I think just in sort of wrapping up here, as you go away, look, you all have your own choices to make, and I'm not trying to have you do anything. But I do think that do you want these things? So, do you want idea meritocratic thinking? I think we are in an era now in which great collective decision-making is so much more powerful than any individual thinking. And if you know how to bring those thoughts together and have idea meritocratic thinking, you have a power that is much greater than any individual. So I recommend idea meritocratic thinking. But when you walk out of this room, you have to think, what does that mean? It's explained in the book. But do you want idea meritocratic thinking or not? Second question, do you want to know what people are really like, including yourself? Do you want to know that or not? Once you answer that question, then you'll pursue it in your own ways. I have suggestions, but I think it's a big, important question. Okay, do you want to be radically truthful and transparent with each other and open-minded? I mean, think about it. Am I causing a lot of trouble with this? Are we going to be truthful and transparent with each other? Is that powerful? What's the problem with being that way? So anyway, you have to think about that. In any of your relationships, it's not just a matter of what your type of company you have. It's everybody in any relationships are going to have to think, how am I going to be with each other? And then algorithmic decision making. Algorithmic decision making. Man, I could tell you that the power of being able to take your thinking and put them into the computer and have the computer operate in parallel is such an enormous power. It's a language that everybody's going to have to speak. Many of us don't know how to speak itself, so maybe you grab somebody who knows how to speak it, but it is the same as those principles that you're operating by in words can be converted into algorithms, and it's extremely powerful. So I think that you're going to have to walk out of here thinking about those types of things, and then I think this is coming at us anyway, because let's say this radical transparency. Everybody can know pretty easily what you're like because of the data that you're leaving about yourself all over the place. So it's become easy for a lot of people to collect that data on you and put together the picture in ways that are better than a lot of people around you. And it's either easy for algorithms to be coming at you and dealing with you instead of people. And so I think we're coming into this world in which this radical transparency and these algorithms and knowing what people are like is upon us anyway. So those are the questions that you're going to have to face. In the process of doing that, we created a bunch of tools. I'm not going to be able to explain those tools to you, but I think you might find them interesting. They're in the appendix to the book. So that's all I have to say. We'll go to the questions and answers now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
You know, in 20 minutes, you were only able to scratch the surface. In an hour, we're only going to be able to scratch the surface. But it all starts with principles. And everybody in this room, I'm sure if you ask them, do they lead a life, a principled life, according to the values that matter most to them, they would say yes. And the principles may come from their religion, from the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. But now we're talking about you and your principles. Where do they come from? Ray Dalio, where do those principles and values come from?
They come from my experiences and then my reflections on them.
So they're principles.
All. They didn't come from, I'm a lousy learner, meaning taking principles or learning from others is not my strong point. And honestly, it's like I have a bad rote memory. I, for the most part, go into experiences and then reflect on them. And of course, I try to reflect on them with the best help I can. So that's my usual path. And then those experiences lead me to seek the best opinions or the best mechanics of why the cause-effect relationships are what they are. I view everything basically as mechanical, as mechanics. In other words, there's cause-effect relationships for everything. In a sense, what makes a good relationship. So for me, I was going after meaningful work and meaningful relationships. I wanted to be on a mission of work that we're, in that mission together with people, and the relationships were very important. So I just went on those missions with those people. And then I encountered the various challenges and I reflected on them and learned from each other and learned them that way.
Okay, so best means the most effective, the ones that brought you closest to your goals.
Yeah, and I think we're now in an era where you have to know them internally. Like, you have to have your own principles. Religion will give you principles to consider, but I think that if you're an independent thinker, you don't want to follow. What you want to do is think for yourself what are the best principles. Good.
All right. Let's dig a little deeper on the idea of meritocracy, because it's so central to your principles. The 3 steps to creating one are, as you said, to put honest thoughts on the table, to have thoughtful disagreement about that. And let me dig a little deeper on that one. How does a thoughtful disagreement differ from emotional or otherwise less legitimate disagreement, and who decides which is which?
What do you mean a less legitimate disagreement?
Well, an emotional disagreement, or a disagreement that's about turf or other
Well,
things.
okay, so it's not, a disagreement exists, and then the question is how do you approach the disagreement? And the approach is one of curiosity, to be able to understand the other party's thinking. So thoughtful disagreement says, I don't know if I'm right or you're right. Usually people view it as an antagonism and they do blocking. Blocking means that they always want to get out their thoughts and they always want to almost block. You could see people interrupt or spew out their thoughts. There has to be an exercise of taking in and motivated by a curiosity and a worry about being wrong, so that one will do protocols like repeating the thing that the other person's trying to say, in order to say, yes, I've got it right. Quite often, if there's a disagreement, it pays to have a mediator who you mutually choose. So let's say you and I have a disagreement, we might say, okay, Harry, let's get Harry to help us through that disagreement. And then go through certain protocols. The protocols are explained in the book, but things like we have the 2-minute rule. Like if you're talking, give me 2 minutes and so that I can get my thought out. And so that's the nature of thoughtful disagreement. Have others be judges on that disagreement and have that kind of open-mindedness along those lines. Then when you're at the end of that disagreement, you have to have some protocol for getting past the disagreement. Everybody has to have a protocol. If you and your wife are having a disagreement, anything, you have to have a protocol. And that protocol, in our case, is what we call believability-weighted decision-making. But let's not worry too much about that exact protocol, because we could digress into that. Now, what believability-weighted decision-making is in an upshot is, because we have a lot of data, and we have that we can assess the merit of different people's ideas, and everybody sort of agrees to the fair rules of doing that. But in any case, it's better than autocratic decision-making, it's better than democratic decision-making, but in any case, you have to have your way of getting past your disagreement. You might say, if you have a disagreement, that if the mediator makes the decision, then you get past it, because you have to get past your disagreement and move on.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds, though, that it's a very slow process. Sometimes in a business, decisions have to be made faster than that. There may be disagreement. Can you bring in a moderator in that case?
No. You can do this any way that you want, that you think is efficient. So that's the end of the thing. Like if you're making, let me describe it, because I'm going to come down, I'm going to go to a higher level and then I'm going to come down to it.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, in this kind of decision-making process, if you find anything impractical, then you find out the practical way of doing it. And so it's just how you're going to think, and then you write your principles. The book is basically a very practical way of operating, because when you don't have enough time, how do you do that? So it's written what the protocols are in that book. But the way it is, for the most part, is by making it very transparent to everybody what you're doing and what protocols you're operating by. There are times where if you have to make a decision in a very short period of time, you're not going to operate that way. You might say, I'm going to postpone that. There's always a responsible party for making a decision. So if you're the responsible party, you go make the decisions in the way that you think is best, consistent with those protocols, though, because we have radical transparency. By radical transparency, I mean we tape everything so that everybody could see things firsthand, so they'll watch how your behavior is.
Yep.
And when you're behaving that way, your notion of I'm going to call in other people when you have that time, how do you handle that? But you're still the responsible party. So if there's a fire and you say, hey, stop, we're going to have to get out of this room, and that's totally consistent with the process. It's how you weigh it well, and through that radical transparency is the important thing. What we find is that over short periods of time, it's longer, and over long periods of time, it's much faster. And the reason it's longer, when we work out how do we do that, what we're doing really is working at how do we make decisions rather than make decisions themselves. And that means that in the future decision making, everything is much faster, right? So if we said, how are we supposed to make that type of decision, rather than just make the decision, that reflection on those criteria establishes the principles, so it accelerates the decision making. So not only the individual decisions become better, but the ways that you're making decisions becomes much faster because you've got down the protocols for doing it right.
Just a few minutes ago, you glossed over one of the aspects of the system at Bridgewater that many people, when they come into the company, find disorienting, and that is that you tape every interaction. Why do you do that, and how do people feel about it?
Just to be clear, there's some that are personal situations and so on that we would not tape. It's our normal protocol to tape, because if you want an idea meritocracy, you have to be able to have people see it themselves. So to throw that open so that everybody can see everything helps to make it an idea meritocracy, because you usually get spin and behind the scenes things. You know, somebody gets fired, you don't know actually why that happened. They have an excuse, somebody else has an excuse. So I believe so much in that transparency. People don't have to do that when they're thinking themselves, do I want to do that? There's a tremendous power. We just, with one very big Silicon Valley company that wants to do this, top group of people said for themselves, can we tape those meetings and those conversations so everybody can listen to it? Can we be radically transparent? And they wrestled with that question. And they thought, well, why couldn't they? And if I'm saying something to you about somebody else, okay, do they get to hear that? So it's they chose to do it. It's a very, very powerful way of operating. But however anybody chooses to do it, the question is, can I be transparent? Can I be transparent, let you see firsthand, or are you going to see spin? You go into most organizations and what you see is spin, and everything goes on behind the scenes. So nobody really knows what's going on, and you have all this office politics operating. If you want to get rid of all those things and have people think for themselves, then you could be able to have people see things for themselves.
Yeah, I'm reminded of sort of the rating system at Uber or eBay. It tends to keep people honest if they know they're going to be rated by their peers or their customers. Must keep people honest if they know that you can look at the tape of what actually happened in that meeting.
Well, it's not me. I did it so that I was on tape. I did it so everybody could watch me on tape, because it pushed me into, when the light is on me and you actually see the difficult decisions, you see people stealing from the company, and how do you deal with that? You see difficult decisions, and by being on tape and then writing it down, why am I making that decision, and writing the principles, and then putting those principles out to say, if you were in the same position, would you do the same things? And then debating those principles that way. I mean, imagine if the CEO of your company could always be on tape so that there's no spin and that others could judge their merit. That is a very powerful way, because through debate, you're either going to bring people along or not, and they'll know the truth. They'll know how you're behaving, as distinct from not knowing the truth. The truth builds trust, okay, and it builds that people own it. Because the alternative is that people then are talking at the water coolers behind it and nobody actually knows what's going on. So no, I didn't do it to watch other people. It's the opposite. I did it so that everybody could be judged. Bad stuff happens in the dark. You put it out in the open and judge it and so on. It's a very powerful way of getting an idea of meritocracy.
In practice, Ray, how much time do people spend reviewing your decisions in this way?
They can see everything all the time. You know, what they do is they, there are a number of Bridgewater people here who could describe it better. But I think the important thing is they know what's going on. They see it all the time. And the answer is a lot. They review all of my decisions, pretty much all my decisions. And the principles that you see written in the book are the ones that I wrote when I'm encountering those things. So what we have in the book is a tool in which you could see those principles, and then a number of cases that are actually video cases, because we tape everything. They're the actual video cases of the situations that prompted those reflections to be able to say, okay, how did you handle that situation?
Okay.
Now the question for you, do you think this is logical, sensible, or illogical?
I think it's incredibly logical. I think it's also extremely rigorous. And I think it is tough for people to implement. I think it would take a lot of soul searching, and I think that's what you witnessed in the case of that Silicon Valley company.
Yes, and if you were in that shoes, you'd have to reflect on why you couldn't be transparent. So that's why, as you going out of this room, as they reflected on it and they chose to go ahead with it, I would encourage each person in their own way to do it. If we have a relationship and we say, I can't be radically truthful and transparent, if you have an idea of meritocracy, so you have to make that choice. How do you wrestle with it? Just how would you wrestle with it? You read the book, I was just curious. I'm curious here how people wrestle with it.
Well, I'm going to dodge that question since you're the guy. You're the only billionaire on this stage.
It has nothing to do with that.
Yet. You know, you make a point in your book, and you alluded to it here, that a key to your success as an investor was to model the market as a machine. And your success as an entrepreneur was to understand your organization as a machine, too, consisting of culture and people, and to understand that the human brain is a machine, too. Do you think that modeling the human brain as a machine is taking the machine metaphor too far?
I'm just trying to tell you what I think a machine is. Let me define a machine. I'm saying everything has cause-effect relationships. And so reality works in a certain way in which there are cause-effect relationships. I don't mean a machine like a crude thing. I think the human body is like a machine, meaning that there are cause-effect. It's a beautiful machine. And I think since the Big Bang, all the forces in the universe and all energy and matter went in this perpetual motion machine, and they're all interacting. And so that there is physiology in the brain that is causing our behaviors and so on. And so I'm not trying to say anything more than that. An organization is a machine in that it has cause-effect relationships that make it, if you do these things, it'll have these kinds of results. And I think that approaching it that way, not being attached to that it should be a certain way, and realizing the beauty of it all, that if you embrace reality and you say reality is a beautiful thing, even the things I can't understand about reality, even the things I don't like, and say, okay, I don't like those things, but rather than push them aside, if you think, okay, how does it work and why? And those deep reflections are then very helpful, because the same things happen over and over again. Over and over again. The financial crisis that last happened is that they happen over and over again, but often not in our own lifetimes. You know, but if you understand that everything happens over and over again in some cause-effect relationship, and then you have principles for dealing with that, and you view the world that way, just being practical to try to get at what you want in life, that is a very powerful approach, and that's what I mean by a machine.
Good. Now, I wanted to give the audience a flavor of the principles for building a great culture. Again, we can't go through everything in the book, but I wanted to pick out a few that I found really striking. So we could start with principle number 3, if that's okay, which is to create a culture in which it's okay to make mistakes. How do you reconcile...
But not okay to learn from them.
Not okay not to learn
That's
from
the
them.
rest of the principle. The rest of that sentence is, it's okay to make mistakes, but it's not okay to not learn from them.
So how do you reconcile that kind of culture with the other imperative, which is to hold people accountable for what they're expected to do?
Everybody, through the learning, is going to make mistakes. And if holding people accountable is for a way of behaving. In other words, do you learn from that mistake? So I have an expression, you can scratch the car, but you can't total the car, right? Because learning, everybody's going to make mistakes. The best batter is going to have a batting average. The question is how you approach those mistakes. So in the evaluation, how do you approach mistakes? That's the most important thing. If you punish people for making mistakes, then they're not going to make mistakes. They're not going to learn. And learning, making mistakes is an essential part of learning. You've got to distinguish that. I think it's one of the tragedies of our society that we punish people for making mistakes and are not really looking at the future. What is the future? It's like my kids, you know. I don't want to punish them for making mistakes. I ask them only one question when I was raising them. Just give me an answer of what would you do differently in the future so that you didn't have that. If you give me that answer, we're good. And if you follow it through. So that's the way I think mistakes should be approached.
Great. All right, thanks. Believability weight your decision making. Now you talked a little bit about believability weighting. So I won't ask you to define it again, but let's say that I'm a Bridgewater employee. I want to raise my believability rating. How do I do that?
First, let me explain what believability-weighted decision-making is, just so you get an idea, by giving an example that kind of everybody would understand. Supposing you're sick, seriously sick, and the best thing you could do is not go to one doctor. The best thing you could do is go to 2 or 3 doctors. And you go to 2 or 3 doctors. The key to success, generally speaking, is to find the 3 smartest people that will disagree with each other in pursuit of your mission. And so you go to the 3 doctors, and if all 3 doctors are saying the same thing, even if you don't believe it, it's probably the best thing to do. And by hearing that, that would be powerful. If you have those 3 doctors that are at odds with each other, and you hear what they're debating, they raise the most important points, and you hear both sides of those, and then you listen to make sense of those types, it'll help you make a decision. At the end of the day, when you're going to make your decision, if there's some of them that are going to disagree with, you'll probably believability weight that decision. You're probably going to say, that one sounded smarter than this one, and so on, and that's how I'm going to make the decision. So that's the kind of thing of believability-weighted decision. Believability-weighted decision, when you're in a room, you could either say, I'm all going to take it in and make a decision, or sometimes you're in a group where you would say, hey, those 3 people know more than I do about the decision, so I would rather have those people make the decision, and by the way, I don't want those other people involved to make that decision because of that. So that's believability-weighted decision-making. Now the question is how you get at believability-weighted decision-making. So we have a lot of data and a lot of protocols that help people understand, okay, that person's more believable in that way. Think about all the different expertises in the room. If we were going to talk about investment decisions or something, maybe I would know more about that. If we're going to talk about designing something of a certain sort or any other thing, the people in the room would be here. So if we collectively wanted to make a good decision, it's so much better to have believability-weighted decision-making, find out who knows what, and then have them triangulate so that we can raise our probabilities to being right. Then if we treated democracy is one, everybody's going to have an equal vote. Well, that wouldn't be silly. If we as a group would make bad investment decisions. Or if we're going to have autocratic decision-making, like I'm going to be able to make the decision for everybody in the room, that would be pretty stupid too, because there are people in the room who know more about it than I do. So that's what believability decision-making looks like.
Okay, good. there are tools at Bridgewater that are unique to your company, and you started to talk about them but didn't have time. But let's talk about some of them now. While we have you on stage. One of the tools that you describe as being one of your most valuable is the baseball cards of employees with their personal stats. What are the stats, and why is that such a useful tool to you?
It's the stats on, all the different stats on people's performance, like a baseball card, right? Mm-hmm. So it describes, it may be people's evaluations of each other, it may be tests, it may be performance, all the data. We collect a lot of data on people, and then we put them in algorithms that most people review, and then it's like a baseball card. It tells what people are strong and weak at.
Okay, good. And the cards are available to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Another one that I found really fascinating is the pain button. How does that work?
Yeah. I think that this idea for everybody, pain plus reflection equals progress, is so valuable that I created an app that people use beyond Bridgewater to help them through that process. And what it means is when you're in a painful experience, it's a very easy thing to record the type of pain and the source of the pain while they're in that. Normally, psychological pain at that time leads to an emotional reaction that has poor reflection. But if it's captured and then it's put into this, then there's a moment of reflection, and it says, how do you reflect on that pain? What are you going to do differently? And then it shows the results over a period of time. So it creates clarity of the type of pain it is. Is it frustration? Is it anger? Is it sadness in its degree? And it plots that through time so that you could see what types of pain you're having. So it provides sort of a biofeedback that you're saying, I'm now having this pain repeatedly, and it connects that to what are you doing about that? And it shows, did you do those things? So that kind of biofeedback with intellectual pain is a very powerful tool to help you improve. So that's what the app is like.
Great. We have, I'd like to turn it over to the audience. So I'm going to ask one more question, and while you line up at the mic, well, actually, people are already lining up, so I'll skip that. Ray, you ready for questions?
Yeah.
Okay, far away.
Cool. So I'm very curious in sort of how...
I'll stand so people can see me.
Sure. Going from your reflections to behavior change, I'm curious about the details of your processes and tools that you use to do that.
Well, it's like any behavior change. The first thing you need to do is reflect on the conflict that you're having between your two yous, as I call it. Do you want the behavior change? It would be the same as diet, or it would be the same as exercise. First, you have to intellectually recognize that, and then you have to have coaching, and usually behavior change, you have to pursue it at the right pace. There's, you know, I like living in life, there's the comfort zone, the stretch zone, and the panic zone. And so at various degrees, you realize that being guided through that at a certain pace so that there is a reprogramming of your mind to develop habit. The most important thing are the habits that you acquire. And if you choose your habits well, and you go through that, knowing that you, at the end of that period of time, can develop a habit that's a healthy habit and you love it, with the right coaching of people, that gets people through it. We call it, you know, sort of getting to the other side. People intellectually want this. They want the radical truthfulness. They want to know what they're good at and what they're not good at, and they want that. People who stay don't want to work anywhere else because otherwise they're in bureaucracies and so on. So they intellectually want it, and then they go through it and they experience those things. We explain why that's normal, and we help them through that process. And then they go and then they start to experience the rewards of it, like exercising or getting stronger and so on. And then when they get that and they become comfortable with it, and they imagine going back to the other way, which is an organization where people don't know what they're going on and they can't communicate what they want and so on. They can't imagine going to that. So you have to take them through that behavior modification that way.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Mr. Dalio. Daniel Goldman. Thank you very much for a thought-provoking presentation. The architecture of global governance is under great strain with the renewed flowering of autocracy, increasing polarization, decline in our civic discourse, and the enshrinement at multilateral institutions of decisions made by leaders whose interests often run counter to the rights and freedoms of the people they purport to represent. How can your mechanism be used to improve our architecture for global governance? And how can technology play a role in that so that we have a 21st century way to make global decisions rather than revert back to 17th century operating systems for global governance?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I think, first of all, I think that the greatest problem is that are we clear on the principles that bind us together and those that separate us? Imagine if we could be crystal clear on what our most principles are. I don't think that we as a country are clear on what our principles are that bind us together and separate us. I don't think that we have a way of having thoughtful disagreement to get past those, and we don't have clear ways of resolving those disagreements, so we're stuck in disputes that are the opposite of an idea of meritocracy, and I think that that's a very fundamental problem. So I think that first agree, those are the problems. Because if you look at history, and I think it's a good example of the evolution over a period of time. Plato's description of how this cycle works. There's the benevolent despot, the benevolent dictator, the person who knows best and will take care of the people and lead in an efficient way. And then you get into a cycle where they're not so benevolent and it doesn't work so well. And then you have a revolution, and then you have the democracy. And then you have, with that democracy, you have checks and balance systems, and they're at odds and how they operate by that. And then the problem with democracy is it becomes inefficient, and then the disputes become so problematic, like you were describing about how do you make a decision effectively, and you can't cut through those decisions, and that then threatens that, and then as a result of that, you have democracies shifting to become autocratic governments. If you go back to the 30s when we had populism, that was the last era of populism, and you look at that, 4 democracies chose to be autocracies so that they can make the system run well, and so then they become autocracies again, and they bring in the benevolent and then they go through the cycle again. And so it's how we're dealing with disputes. I think that we're in a situation now where we're in a dangerous situation, because we're in a situation where capitalism is not working for a large percentage of the population, and as a result there are economic differences, and if we have an economic downturn, I think that's threatening. And then there's a challenge to democracy in the way of whether we can have thoughtful and productive disagreement. So I think that recognizing that as a primary issue is a big deal, and then saying, okay, how do we go above it? What are our principles, and how do you work that through? But at least if we recognize it and then have that thoughtful disagreement, and you could do idea meritocratic. But the question is who's going to do that and how, so I don't know the answers to that one.
Thank you.
How do you differentiate, or do you differentiate between immutable principles and potentially empirically verifiable or falsifiable principles? I mean, are all these principles contingent permanently on data and subject to potential revision, or are there some that are, in some sense, sort of absolute? So I guess it's a kind of logical positivism.
I just think of it as like you can make...
Ray, may I interrupt? I'm afraid this has to be the last question. We need to get Mr. Dalio onto the next meeting. Go ahead, Ray.
I just think about, like, you're going to make decisions. Now, how do you make decisions? You're going to then weigh it on the basis of the evidence. And however you go about it, write it down, check whether your theory is consistent with the evidence, and then that's how you do it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.